Brian was unsure what to do. He thought to himself, I'm too embarrassed to leave my room. He sat there for about 5 minutes, pondering his next move. He realized that Mrs. Alexander had probably seen this a million times before. Brian said to himself, oh geez, I'm going to have to go down there. Brian opens the door and says to himself, here goes nothing. He also thinks to himself, what a weird sensation I am feeling, but anyway. Brian goes down the stairs and gently knocks on Mrs. Alexander's door. Mrs. Alexander promptly opens the door and says, what is it? Without Brian saying anything. Mrs. Alexander looks down and sees what the issue is. She says, oh honey, you need a diaper change. Mrs. Alexander didn't have a table, but she put a mat down on the floor, laid Brian down, unfastened the tabs, cleaned him up, and put a new one on him. Brian was unsure what to think of this whole process. It wasn't as bad as he had imagined. In some ways, it felt nice. He enjoyed it a little. It made him feel nurtured, but he would never admit it to anybody. He was very stubborn. She told him to get ready for dinner time. She mentioned she had made a new dish, part of the experiment. Very nutritional, but a little on the bland side. She instructed him to wash his hands. Brian went to the bathroom, washed his hands, and walked to the dining room. Mrs. Alexander told him to sit down and that dinner would be ready in a minute. But before that, she put a bib on him. Brian was about to open his mouth to say something, and Mrs. Alexander said, don't worry, we need to keep our little one clean, she said with a non-serious tone. This is also part of the experiment. They sat down at the dinner table. She put a bowl in front of Brian. She told him it was berry parade, very nutritious. And if you're hungry later, I'll give you some peanuts or something. Hesitant at first, Brian put a spoon in the berry puree, put a little in his mouth, liked it. Then he began to eat the bowl, finishes it up, then eats 2 more bowls. Mrs. Alexander goes, you enjoy that, don't you? Brian goes, yes, and continues to eat. After they get done eating, Mrs. Alexander informed Brian he needs to take a bath, and because of the medication he takes, she will have to watch him in case he gets too sleepy in the bath. It's going to be a little awkward, she says, but I have to watch you because of the medication I gave you has a strong sedating effect. Mrs. Alexander filled up the bathtub while Brian watched TV. A short time later, grabbing Brian by the hand, she walked him to the bathroom. She undressed him and told him to sit in the bathtub. Brian sits in the bathtub. It's a strawberry bubble bath, reminiscent of when he was a kid and his mom used to give him baths. But those times were over. He was a college student now, trying to get his business degree. But it was such an awkward sensation. He was 22 and being given a bath by somebody not much older than him. She lifted up his arm, wiped under his armpits, and cleaned him all over. Time to get out, honey, she says. She then dried him well with a towel and told him to use the bathroom before she puts on a clean diaper. Then she informed him that she got him some pajamas. I got you some new pajamas. They look a little funny, but for the experiment, she replies. He finishes up using the bathroom. Then Mrs. Alexander lays another mat on the ground and puts a diaper on him. Then she brings out these pajamas with jungle animals on them. Brian said, what the hell? And Mrs. Alexander goes, we need the pajamas from this material. Don't ask why. I'm sorry about the design. This is all we have right now. Fine, they'll do, Brian says back to her. Then she helps him put on the pajamas. I don't need any help, Brian insists. But Mrs. Alexander insists. While you're getting used to the medication, it's going to be a little awkward. But I'm going to have to help you with some very basic things. Do you think you can handle that? Brian shakes his head. Yes. Then Mrs. Alexander told Brian that they could watch a movie before he went to bed, but he had to go to bed at exactly 9:30 for the experiment. Mrs. Alexander puts on Toy Story and told him that she was going to watch how he responds to the movie. Then she came out and brought him some popcorn and some grape juice in a sippy cup. He watched the movie, giggled, and laughed. He even forgot that he was wearing a diaper and goofy pajamas. After the movie concluded, Mrs. Alexander says, time for bed, honey, and leads him by the hand to bed. He falls asleep promptly, but then in the middle of the night, Brian woke up with a strong urge to use the bathroom, and not just for a number 1. He was unsure what to do. End of chapter 2.